And I did have this sense that maybe business could be the most dynamic, the most innovative element of modern society. I mean, I certainly knew school and church were not innovative and dynamic, so maybe business would be. But I had this sense that business is maybe dirty. Well, first of all, although I studied physics, I didn't know enough to know that the purpose of the business enterprise, at least officially, is to increase shareholder wealth. And that sounds, in the kind of biblical terms that I'd picked up at church, it sounds like greed. Profit sounds like greed, right? And Jesus seemed to be against greed. So the whole setup of business seemed, like I say, dirty or polluted. And then I assumed that what it takes to get ahead in business is, well, I was going to be in sales. I got a job at IBM in sales. So I was going to be in sales. So I assumed the way you're successful in sales is to get people to buy things that they don't need at high prices.
So you really had kind of a...
Yeah, why did I take this job? I must have had no conscience.
Just a little bit of a bias there, yeah.
And that climbing the corporate ladder, meant stepping on the hands of people on the rung below you or something like that. And my church was quite happy to confirm this view. I mean, people say to me, it must be really hard to be a Christian and work at IBM.
I can tell you, I have worked for some companies that are more holy than churches I've worshipped in.
I would say...
By that I mean companies that are really trying to move the needle, to have a certain standard of how they treat people, their clients, their employees, and it's of course not perfect, but incredibly admirable. And I've been in some churches that are dysfunctional and as screwed up as they come.
The nice thing about business
is... And I love the church, so PS.
And I do too. Yeah. But the nice thing about business is if you disagree with someone, at some point you have to confront them. You have to bring it out in the open and you have to engage in a conflict. Whereas at church, if you disagree with someone, you can just ignore them. And so, conflict can just fester for generations.
Yeah. Well, I think corporate world, for all of its flaws, there's more transparency, there's more oversight, there's more channels you could raise your hand. If you do have a boss who's toxic, or there's channels in bigger companies with helplines and so forth to try to remediate that.
And you have customers to decide whether you're providing a worthwhile service or not. And that's what I discovered is pretty quickly realized, actually, at least in a business where you have repeat customers,
right.
The actual way to be successful in sales is to always put your customer first. And so, not to sell them something they don't need, as if they're dumb enough to buy something they don't need anyway. But always to look for and IBM, we didn't have price flexibility in those days, so there wasn't a question of pricing. But to think of yourself, to work as a servant of your customer. And then I also realized you need, in a technology business, there are a lot of experts in the office that you're going to need their help. And so the way to be successful is not to elbow everybody out of the way. It's to serve the people around you, so that they'll want to serve you. And so suddenly the success factors seem to be service, not greed. Right. And I thought, well, now that sounds more like Jesus. Mm. But why am I having such a hard time? I'm not really getting the kind of help I need to bring these together. And that actually has been a very defining theme of my life, is what could the Christian faith and churches do to actually help people who are in other kinds of work, especially business, live biblically or live Christianly, which turns out to be a great way, at least to be an IBM salesman. Just follow the ideas of Jesus. Pretty good way to be successful, actually.
One of my professors, when I left investment banking and studied theology for a few years, he said, don't forget that the Ten Commandments weren't there to punish you; they're there to help you. Yeah. If you follow them, you'll have a richer, more wholesome, flourishing life.
So this question of what does Christian faith have to do with work which is kind of my obsession and my profession now.
Actually, say it again. What's your obsession and profession?
What does Christian faith have to do with ordinary work?
Got it. So essentially it's how we open up Bible, Wall Street Journal.
Bible, Wall Street Journal, although in 12th grade I wasn't reading the Wall Street Journal. But at a simpler level, what does the Christian faith have to... Because I'm always convinced that, well, honestly, there's no bishops here like everything, right?
You're safe.
I'm not sure that I like going to church all that much. I certainly didn't when I was a kid.
Right.
The Christian faith was important to me, but it seemed to me it had to be something more than going to church. Otherwise, what was the point? Because I didn't.
I've got a hunch that there are a lot of people privately nodding their head in the room, but that's not an uncommon thing to hear.
So it must be for all of life. I mean, that's what's taught, right? So anyway, I'm at this gas station, and the thing about this gas station is if you came to our gas station white, you got full service. I mean, this was back, we washed your windshield, we checked your oil, we asked you if you wanted the key to the restroom, we called you sir, we called you ma'am. If you came black, we pumped your gas.
And none of the other courtesies?
We didn't wash your windshield or offer you the restroom key or check your oil. We certainly didn't call you sir or ma'am. And I think it was probably the same at every gas station in southern Delaware. But it bothered me. I think I knew enough of the Christian faith. I mean, I was 12th grade, right, to know that treating black people differently or anybody differently because of their race is wrong. So I had this maybe...
But even the fact that it sort of clicked, I mean, a lot of people wouldn't even have clicked and gotten that point. So what'd you do with it then?
Nothing. I mean, well, the only thing I did was I treated everybody the same. So if I happened to be the gas jockey and you came in, then whoever you were, I called you sir, I checked your oil.
Regardless of their color or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
And the other kids, other boys who worked at the gas station, kind of teased me about it or
really?
Called me names that in retrospect are kind of funny that you could be upset by someone calling you that. But I do remember that was a little countercultural. But I didn't do anything systemic. And much later I realized there's actually a story to go to the Bible and the Bible and the gas station. There's actually this story in the Bible that's I realized could have helped me, which is Nabal, David, and Abigail. Now, if you don't have to remember this story, it's probably not the most...
So let's say I've never heard the story before. Set it up for us.
So David is not yet the king of Israel. He's a rebel with a band of guerrillas up in the hills. Mm-hmm. And the hills are next to the ranch of a guy named Nabal. Nabal is a wealthy landowner. And so David suggests to him that he should donate a flock of lambs to feed David's army. Nabal's a hot-headed guy. He doesn't appreciate this shakedown very much. And so he insults David in front of David's own soldiers. So it creates a problem for David. And says, forget it, I'm not going to do that. And so David goes back to camp and begins to prepare an attack. And his plan is to kill Nabal and all the male members of Nabal's clan, which would have been hundreds of people, like a kind of mini genocide. Nabal's wife is named Abigail, and she, although she has no real role, right? She's not one of the antagonists in this. She decides to take things in her own hands, and she has her women prepare a feast, which they carry up to the hills to David's army, and they actually do feed David's army. And then she makes what's probably the most polite speech in the Bible. This is in 1 Samuel 25, I think. Mm-hmm. And so she kind of butters them up a little bit, and then she says, "But the Lord save you from incurring blood guilt, so that you'll never have to suffer pangs of conscience for what you're about to do." So she kind of wraps this speech, you're about to commit murder, in this kind of velvet glove, and confronts him, and he changes his mind and calls off the attack.
It's interesting she ties in conscience, too, that later you'll have a plagued conscience.
Yeah, so that you won't feel guilty later is really her main argument. And I realize, so what she did was, she brought him a gift, and then she spoke to him courteously and politely, but she had a real pointed message. Yeah. And I realized I could have done the same at the gas station, although I thought of myself as a gas jockey with no power. Actually, I was bringing the owner a gift every time I was on shift, because I was one of only two guys who didn't steal from the cash register drawer. And he knew that. That's why I got paid 8 cents an hour more than some of the other guys. So I was bringing him a gift. I was doing something for him, and that's why I put me on closing shift usually too. So I would print out the cash register tape. I'd cut the cash register tape, put the money in the bag, and take it to his house. And so one night I could have said something like, John, if you're ever wondering why the money in my bag always matches the cash register tape. It's the same reason I treat black people well at the pumps. Because the reason I treat you with respect is because it's in my heart to treat everyone with respect. And, maybe if you wanted a gas station, where all your employees treated you and your money with respect, you could have a gas station where all your employees treated all of your customers with respect. Just an idea, see at the pumps in the morning. And it just never occurred, which is kind of what Abigail did. Yeah. It just never occurred to me that somebody like me, a kid at the gas pumps, could confront or could discuss something like that with the owner. And in retrospect, I think he would have listened to me. I mean, he would have yelled at me for sure, but he wouldn't have fired me. And I think it might have stuck his conscience. It might have pricked his conscience.
And there's a few other stories in the Bible also, in the Old Testament in particular, that talk about speaking truth to power would be the language you use today.
Right.
And most of them they're not sort of the strident, self-righteous, holier than thou, getting up in a pulpit and beating someone up for their behavior. They're appealing to heart, to conscience, to reason. So, it's really extraordinary. And the theologians and philosophers talk about sins of commission and sins of omission. So you're really talking about a sort of a sin of omission. When it wasn't that you did something bad. In fact, relatively speaking, you were better than your fellow gas jockeys, but it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough.
Right.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that story. It's interesting that all these years later, that's a defining story for you.
Yeah, it is, really.
Yeah. So tell me about some of your corporate life. Did you feel a good alignment, or as you became older, more mature, between this Wall Street Journal and Bible metaphor we're using, or was it chalk and cheese?
No, I was going to be a physicist, and then at the last minute realized that the pace of physics is slow.
Did you say pace or pay?
Pace.
Pace. Okay,
pace.
Just checking.
You're in the lab for years working on one project, and I got bored as a senior doing my senior lab thesis. So I thought this is not good. So I decided to get a job in business. Actually, my uncle Dick Sandberg, who's here, lured me to the dark side. He's an entrepreneur. And helped me realize that actually something could happen.
So coming back to this theme of your gas station theme, and you've reiterated of saying something, taking an issue that's problematic and putting it in the open, putting light on it, shining light on it. Didn't you have an experience when you were, was it your Goldman Sachs job or somewhere where you chimed in on a presentation and you didn't have the party line?
Well, no, actually, I have lots of failure stories, but I actually have one success story in terms of Christian faith, and that is I was at McKinsey, actually, and we had a client. Most of the work on this study was being done by people from the client, which was I probably shouldn't say who it was, but it was a big company. And so each of us in McKinsey had a couple of client teams with 4 or 5 people on each team, and we were leading them. And then the whole thing, so this is 50 or 60 people, the thing, after a couple of weeks of getting organized, the senior partner flew in from Houston and made the opening presentation to the whole team. And he's like 15 words into his talk, and one of the guys on my team raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I've been reading, there's a lot of research that really questions whether consultants add long-term value to their clients." And so before we begin this study, I really think the first thing we should study is, whether McKinsey is really going to be able to help us in a kind of long-term way.
I love it.
And I figured the part is just going to, bust the gut, right? This is how you become a McKinsey partner, I guess. He was so smooth. He said, "Oh, thank you so much for that insight, and I've been keeping up with some of this research," and he dealt with the objection and continued as if nothing had happened. But afterwards, I was an engagement manager. The senior engagement manager, so 2 levels below the senior partner, came to me and he said, "Get Jim off the team."
The guy who asked the question.
The guy who asked the question. And right at the moment, all I could think of was Jesus saying, he was asked, "How many times should I forgive my brother? Even 7 times?" And he responded, "No, forgive your brother 7 times 70. And so I thought this theme of forgiveness, you get a second chance, is pretty important to the Christian faith. And so but I had no time to think. I just kind of blurted out, "Well, actually, I think Jim could do a good job. even though it was the most boneheaded thing we've ever seen. Like give me 2 weeks to work with him. And to my surprise, the senior engagement manager said to me, "Really? All right, 2 weeks, but it's on your head if anything like that ever happens again." And so then I went to Jim's office and, kind of drill sergeant on him. Don't you ever do a question like that? You don't raise it from that. And at the end, actually, the same senior partner gave him an award. One of two people on the client team that got an award for contributing most to the team.
Well, you were saying the other day when we were chatting, just kind of getting in the zone for our time this morning. You said that the kind of the core theme of the Christian story is what?
Redemption. Yeah. So I've been asked a lot about. What does it mean to take a Christian view into business, which most businesses are, they're secular.
Yeah,
right?
Secular, multi-faith.
Right.
Yeah.
So isn't this, and Laura Nash, do you remember, of course, Laura Nash has written about the fears that businesses have that by allowing religious expression, there will be conflict because religions, would have different perspectives. But if I ask, really, is there any difference between the Christian faith and any other faith when it applies to business?
So like ethics, values, how you treat customers, that sort of thing.
It's not like, the Christian faith says, be honest, and some other faith says lie. I mean, in terms of business ethics, I think there's actually a lot of commonality.
That's very true.
But if you ask what's distinctive about the Christian faith, I think it has an extra emphasis on redemption or forgiveness or, the idea that everyone's messed up and therefore God's answer, God's way to move the world the way He's always intended, the beautiful way He's always intended for the world, is not to get rid of the bad people, because that would mean getting rid of everybody.
Us included.
Us included.
Yeah.
But to offer second chance, redemption, and to give us the power, so there's a kind of a power also to actually be better than you can make yourself. And so it seemed to me that the Christian faith is sort of the special interest group of redemption. That doesn't mean that somebody gets let off the hook. I mean, I certainly didn't try to let Jim off the hook.
Right.
But it does mean that there's I'd like to bring an extra hope for redemption or a second chance or education.
It reminds me. Do y'all remember in the New Testament, Jesus has this story with the woman at the well, and she's about to be stoned for adultery. And let's assume that the fact pattern is accurate. Let's assume she was an adulteress, and it was a stonable offense, which is hard to imagine today. But just before the men were about to stone her, Jesus says what? "Ye who are without sin can cast the first stone." And everyone slowly puts down their stones and they walk away. And then he tells the woman, but the people forget the last line of the story is Jesus says to the woman, "Go and sin no more." So there's this redemptive. So first he saves her life. Second he forgives her, he redeems her. But she still says, but you have to clean up your act. And so there's this gentle, firm balance that we see in some of these powerful biblical stories. Any failures you want to share? Because that was a nice story.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that probably put me in the position to think that way is the summer between my years at business school. I worked for an investment bank. I guess I won't name them. This coming from this small town and from a non-Ivy League kind of university. First of all, to be at Harvard Business School, I was kind of a little odd.
Well, sure.
And then to be working at a big Wall Street investment bank. This was a big deal. And I made a mistake like the first week I was there, which I was assigned to do a piece of research, which I thought I did it the right way, but I did it the wrong way, and I turned it in at the end of the day. And I came back the next day, and my manager said to me, that what's wrong with you? I had to stay here all night to redo all the work you did yesterday. It was a total failure, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood it. I'll fix it today." No, I've already done that. That's why I was here till midnight. You're hopeless. Just go to the team room and stay out of the way. And that happened the first week.
Encouraging way to start.
Yeah, and he was completely right. I mean, it wasn't like it was an unfair assessment. But on the other hand, I'm capable of good work. I just misunderstood, and I didn't take the time to understand what he actually wanted. I just made some assumptions. And then I thought I had 9 really. Well, I got taken off that team right away. But I thought I had 9 good weeks after that doing terrific work on other teams, which I got feedback that I did. But the way you get invited back to an investment bank at the end of the summer is everybody you work with votes.
Unanimous.
And it's got to be unanimous, right? And it wasn't. So they called me and said, we will not be inviting you back. And
you must have been devastated.
It was. Even though by then I decided I didn't want to be an investment banker. When they told me, you're not getting a job, I'm like, what do you mean I'm not getting a job? So it did kind of potentiate me, I guess, for this idea that actually you can make a mistake and still actually be a pretty good worker.
Yeah. Well, I maybe like some of you in the room are thinking, almost everyone I've met, and myself included, that the mistakes are not fun. They're painful, they're embarrassing, and often we think the world will come to an end. But most people, they'll remember them, and they change as a result of them. That the deepest growth moments happen. In fact, we had Cheryl Batchelder, the former CEO of Popeyes here, a month or two ago, was it, with Holly? And she kept talking about the time she got fired from the head of running KFC, and the time she screwed up when she was she kept talking about her failures, because those are the moments I grew. Was it fun? Absolutely not. It was horrible. Yeah. But that's where she grew.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I think I later went into the entrepreneurial world, and there's a kind of an adage: third product succeeds, which means primarily you have to have enough funding to make 2 mistakes.
You got that, Jose?
And I'm on the board of Cancer Biotech now. I'm really hoping that's true, because we've been through 2.
You're the chairman of the board.
No, I'm the chairman of the compensation
committee. Okay, right.
But we've been through 2 drug failures, so I'm hoping third product really does succeed. Yeah.
So let's shift to this Episcopal priest thing and theology of work. Help us about that, and then I want to get some questions coming.
Yeah.
So what is theology of work? What's this crazy Episcopal priest thing and all?
Well, I did have this tension between faith and work that I talked about before, that I hoped my church would help me with, and that just never really happened. I never really asked my church to help me as far as that goes. So it's not just a failure of pastors, but I actually.
By the way, I shouldn't be picking on the Episcopal Church. In my research, and it's just neutral empirical research, all the denominations are asleep at the switch at this question of what we're trying to do here at GLF, of how do I integrate faith into work? How do I connect the dots? And at most, I don't fault the clergy themselves, but the seminary systems that train the clergy to be clergy. They're trained to ignore this issue. I'm sorry, go ahead.
The only exception might be some Jewish denominations, I think. Rabbis actually, there are business people that say my rabbis have been helpful to me.
Good point. I have heard that for sure, and also a lot of the Jewish theology has a material dimension to it, and sometimes Christians want to spiritualize the faith and forget the material, like day-to-day stuff. So, but thank you for that. That's a good point. Great point.
But I have to admit, I thought I was leaving the business world, so I couldn't resolve these tensions, so I'll just jump ship and I'll become a parish minister. But I kept getting pushed back into the business world. Well, one thing, I had a family by then, and I had to support them, so I sort of did some freelance consulting, which paid the bills. And I found that actually there was more interesting stuff happening in some of my clients than there was, in the churches where I was serving as an intern, and just in terms of, what's God doing in the world. And I have confessed, I get a little bored by worship. I mean, do you know this? That actually pastors spend their time leading worship. I don't know why I didn't realize that until
you started to do it.
They don't really spend their time much out with people, helping them think about God's work in the world. And so I came out of seminary resolved to in some way try to find a way to bring this, to go back into this question, to maybe address business in a different way. And I had, I guess, either providential or random, depending on your theology, connection that got me into a half-time position at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Right.
Going back to hoping the seminaries would do differently. Leading a center for faith and ethics in the workplace. And that led me to realize that there's just a much deeper kind of research work that needs to be done to ask, well, what does the Bible and the rest of the Christian faith really have to say about work? Is it 1 or 2 passages, or is there more than that? So since 2007, I've been leading this project called Theology of Work Project. We produce resources for applying the Christian faith, especially the Bible, to all kinds of work, especially business, but really any kind of work. And we ended up stumbling into the idea you can distribute information by the web, not just by printed books. And so we have a website, theologyofwork.org, We're getting about 2 million people a year visiting. So there really, as you said, there really is a demand for bringing the Christian faith and business together. And so we post everything for free there. And our central product is a commentary. We went through the Bible. This took 7 years with a team of 150 people from around the world.
So 150 people around the world, 7 years, and you went through all 66 books.
Yep.
And so what's the output?
So we ended up commenting on 859 passages of the Bible.
Wow.
That we thought either were about work or had something concrete to offer to the world of work. So for instance, one of them would be 1 Corinthians 12, the gifts of the Spirit, which talks about the gifts, talents, skills of all people contributing to the common work. It happens to be said in the church because Paul's work was in a church, but it applies, we believe, equally well to any kind of work. So that's one of the 859. Right. When we started, I didn't think it was going to take 7 years because I thought there's probably 30 or 60, maybe 100 passages of Scripture that have something to do with work, like Colossians 3, I'm not good with numbers, 22, 24, right? Whatever your work, do it as unto the Lord. I thought there's a few of those, and we'll explore those. But what I didn't realize is how much about work is in the Bible. I've come to realize that I used to think the Bible was a book about religion, and religion must have some applications to the rest of life. But it's not. The Bible is a book about God. And it turns out, if you can just read it straight, that where God shows up where God's people are. And that's mostly at work. It's not. The Bible doesn't really happen in the synagogue or the temple. A little bit. But it mostly happens where people are at work. Fields, flocks, armies.
Yeah. Well, the Bible attributes and catalogs 40 parables. 40 is a big biblical number of floods, lost in the wilderness, and so forth, you might remember. And of those 40, well over half of these parables either are situated in or about the workplace, using the workplace as a springboard to make a spiritual or a theological point. So, I mean, it's kind of echoing what you're saying. It's extraordinary. I mean, the first verb in the Bible is God's working, God's creating.
Yeah, how about not?
Exactly. So who uses this theology of work? Like, could I use it, or this website, this resource? I mean, what do I do with it? It sounds like it's a good resource.
Yeah. So our hope is, to go back to the church, that every time a pastor preaches, he or she would take whatever topic or passage they're preaching on and think, does this apply to people's work of all kinds, their whole life's work, not just job, and maybe add a little bit about what it says about work. And so that's where the Bible commentary came from. But probably most people are in business or other kind of work aren't saying, today's problem is, how does Matthew 5:5 apply to my job? So this happens to be about Matthew at work. And I actually chose this one because blessed are the meek, 5:5. That passage has always troubled me because I didn't think you could get as an IBM salesman or an executive, I didn't think meek was one of the key success factors. So I've always thought, is Jesus still a little bit upset with me, for going into this? And actually, there's a wonderful story there from Peter Pace, General Peter Pace, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Army, talking about how this passage, "Blessed are the meek," was actually important to his formation as a soldier and as a leader.
Really?
It actually contributed positively to being an Army general.
So on that, just as an aside, one of the things I actually remember from my seminary studies, having to learn biblical Hebrew and Greek, was that the Greek word for meek actually would be better translated restrained power. Think about restrained power. So you have power, but you restrain, you discipline yourself, you hold back a little bit. So meek sounds a little bit almost like kind of wimpy, whereas and maybe the general had this insight that having restrained power is that person is blessed.
Well, I'll leave that as a cliffhanger. If you want to know what the general said, go to our website. And so we've tried to add. Eventually, we hope to get to all of these passages of Scripture some kind of anecdote or story. Probably only about a quarter of them have one right now.
That's
a story or a video or an illustration from someone's real life. But the next thing we have is topics. Here it is, meekness in the military. We have a page that's called on the front homepage, you might have seen a button that said Christians Who Work. And that takes you to a kind of collection of things that are more focused on the person who's not coming with the question, what does a Bible passage say, but is interested in calling a vocation. Number one topic people come to, especially younger people, come to our website. What kind of work does God want me to have? Is God calling me to something? And so here we have a contractor talking about calling in terms of being a contractor. What does calling mean if you hate your job? And then other things that have been popular with workplace Christians is how to make the right decision, something more general. I'm faced with a decision. How do I know God's leading? And this is the number one piece we have on our website: working through failure. So we talked about that before, and the idea that failure can actually be a growing experience. Yeah. And this reminds me that another group of things we have is devotionals. There's an app called Bible.com. I think there's 150 million people in the world who've downloaded, maybe it's more than that now, have downloaded this app. And one of the features it has is called reading plans, or we might call them devotionals, on a topic. And so we've written 20 or 30 topics. We pioneered with them a category on work. And so we have 20 or 30 topics that you can read a 4 to 14 day-by-day devotional. It takes about 10 minutes to do. And working through failures and how to make the right decision are both in these devotionals.
So essentially, these are practical takeaways and tools that we could use, not just the clergy, but just regular folks like you and me.
And that's the idea.
That's terrific. That's terrific. What a huge effort. Thank you.
The next step is a generation that doesn't like to read to get information. And so we're beginning to experiment with podcasts. We'll probably have some podcasts coming out in the next year.
Yeah. You know, I teach a class, some of you know, down at Princeton, called Business Ethics and Modern Religious Thought. That's the boring title. And the students call it How to Succeed Without Selling Your Soul. That's the nickname. Like Art in the Dark, Physics for Poets. So they call it How to Succeed Without Selling Your Soul. And there's 2 required texts for the whole course. I look at business ethics through the lens of religious traditions, and not just Christianity, but Judaism, Islam, and so forth. And what do these great traditions have to say about business ethics? Well, the reality is a lot. Kind of your point earlier as far as how to treat people fairly, honestly, and so forth. But I say that there's 2 required texts. One is whatever your tradition, or if you don't have one, your grandmother's tradition. What was their text? So you have to have a Bible or a Quran or whatever it might be. And the other thing is you have to have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. Then I hold up a paper, the Wall Street Journal, and then people look at me and go, "Oh, by the way, this is called a newspaper." So, well, let's shift into questions that some of you might have for Will on things we've been talking about.
Well, I guess this 12th grade, gas station story is one. Clearly, the owner's, ethics and values weren't aligned with mine, and so what I did there was did what I thought was right, and I was willing to get fired, but I didn't choose to quit. So I think that's probably the answer is. Well, I've certainly come to a view of don't quit, get fired, and that is true in many ways besides just ethically. But I think if I know what the right way is, do it as long as I can, and maybe that will infect. Maybe it's a viral approach. Maybe that will infect the society around you. Now, when I was at IBM, I did have this question: Is it worthwhile? Is enriching IBM shareholders, which I think mistakenly believed was the whole point of IBM, is that worth spending a life on? And I eventually came to the answer no. And that's one of the reasons I left IBM. I now realize that actually that's kind of a economic fiction, that the purpose of a business enterprise is enriching its shareholders. It's more complicated than that. And sometimes I think maybe I should have stayed longer to see what was possible, because it's a pretty big platform, actually.
I'd add something, because the students will raise that as well, that question, and it's a reality, it's a real world question, and a couple of things I would say that draw on some. Paul talks in one of the books, one of his letters. St. Paul talks about being a noisy, clanging gong, and what I suggest also to folks is you got to pick your battles carefully. Which are ones that you're prepared to go to the mat for and be fired, and know full well what the ramifications of that are, and which are ones that we just have to sort of suck it up and take a deep breath and carry on. Because if we speak out against every thing that's disaligned with our faith. The reality is different ones have different materiality. Which are ones that resign over ones, and which are ones you just sigh to yourself and try to fix and do the best you can. So I would just add that. But I think the point of being ready, are you willing to go to the cross? Are you willing to take the hit? That's a big question.
I got great advice on that from at the end of Harvard Business School from a professor. I don't think was a religious believer of any kind, but he said to all of us, you're about to go out and make a lot more money than you've ever made before, but the only way to preserve your integrity over a career is to live below your means. Don't take on the kind of debt to buy a house or whatever. That means you can't afford to quit, because if you can't afford to quit, you don't own your soul anymore. That was great advice.
Interesting. Very interesting, yeah.
So I have an anecdote. I don't know if this is research or not, but I had the privilege for a long time of working with Tom Phillips, who was the chairman of Raytheon, defense contractor for a long time. And he showed a video he made, this is in the late 70s, and it's just as simple as him saying, we want to compete hard for every contract that we're capable of fulfilling. But we never want to cut ethical corners to do it. And so if you're ever presented with an opportunity that requires bribery, whether that's sort of under, whether you can get away with it or not, or any other kind of unethical transaction, the answer is no. We won't do that. And if you're finding anybody in your chain of command that you think is not helping you make that decision, you just call my office. And he had everybody in the company see this. And at the time I thought, really, who's going to believe I can just call the CEO, because my boss. But of all the major defense contractors in that era, I think Raytheon was the only one that never did have any kind of a scandal or a questionable transaction.
It's a good question. It's hard to to measure the opportunity cost of something which didn't occur. So it's a tricky one from an academic point of view to measure it. But I would agree with the anecdotal approach that I've done a lot of work with Deloitte over the years, and they'll tell stories of walking away from certain deals. And this isn't to say that they're perfect and their competitors aren't, but one of their competitors, this is now probably 10 years ago, was very aggressive in tax advice, and later the IRS ruled against them. So they made a bucket full of money in the first X years and then paid through the nose to make up for it later. One of the banks I work with, in fact, they're the head of their investment client group, sort of essentially the number 2 to the bank, has come and talked to my students, and he talks about some of the foreign exchange trading things that they got caught up in and paid $2 billion worth of fines or whatever it was. He said, we only made a few $1 million profit. So those stories are now starting to circulate that when you cross a line, usually the price of getting caught later is geometrically more than the short-term gain.
Actually, I almost forgot about this. I was in the branch manager's office when I was an IBM salesman having a discussion with her when she received a call from our biggest customer. And I thought she wanted me to step out of her office, but she said, no, you should just shut your mouth, but listen to this. And it was a call in which they told her that they had a black sales rep, and they wanted the white guy. And they tried to dance around that, but it was clear what they wanted. And she told them, and they threatened to take away their business. And she said, "Go ahead, we don't want your business." That really made an impression on me. And that was, of course, IBM policy. But I think her decision wasn't based on IBM policy; it was based on her ethical formation. And so maybe part of the answer to the question is, churches or other institutions that should form people ethically, maybe we just need to have lots of ethically formed people out there who are willing to make that decision whether they're getting the kind of corporate support they think they need or not. Well, I will say there's one thing I think is a danger. When you have executives, maybe a Christian who owns a company, it kind of becomes a Christian company, right? And you have some experience with things like that.
Yeah, I'll chime in after you're done, but go on this. Yeah.
I think that the danger is to confuse a church or a family with a company. So, for instance, if you call your company a family, I just think that's bad, because you can't fire family members, but companies can and do have to fire employees sometimes. So maybe this is what you're going to. I think you can go too far to kind of try to churchify a company. That's not. Companies are a different sphere, and so ethical action, including with caring for people, is just different in a company from what it is in a family or a church, for instance.
Yeah, picking up on that, I'd say that I'm always suspicious when a religious name is used as an adjective.
Yeah.
It's like a Christian company or a Jewish company or fill in the blank. That complicates it. It's a company, and I think the distinction between a company might be comprised of many religious employees, but I get a little anxious when it's framed as particularly if it's publicly traded. If it's a smaller family business, I'm more open to the concept. So I think the question alone prompts a question about the question, and really, so what do we do if we're engaged in a company that's just a regular old company, and how do we bring ourselves who we are as people of faith? Again, whatever the faith tradition is, not just Christians, and how do we make a difference? How do we bring salt and light to that marketplace? How do we help and encourage our coworkers or our subordinates or even our bosses? How do we speak truth to power? How do we find meaning and purpose even in drudgery and things that are difficult? Yeah.
I do remember, this has been quite a while, 15 years ago, coming across a group, a Christian Business Alliance kind of group, a small group in one city. But one of their purposes was to bless the people of God or something like that by having Christian companies buy from one another. And I had this terrible negative reaction to that immediately. It was because when I was at IBM, I ended up with a retail territory. And in the city I worked in and in the retail business, a lot of my customers were Jewish companies or companies owned by Jews. And I remember one of the other salesmen at IBM saying, "Oh, you're going to have trouble because those people only buy from themselves, and you're not Jewish." And I found it to be completely false what he said. So I felt it was kind of a slander against my customers, which didn't make me very happy. And then to find out it was a slander against Jews that was false, but here was a group that was trying to make the same thing true about Christian companies, just really, really appalled me.
Yeah, some of you might remember Martin Luther, the great heretic. Well, actually, he would say he never left the Catholic Church. He would say the Catholic Church left itself. But Luther was one of his colorful statements. He was asked the question by one of his students: should you buy shoes? This is very poignant, from a Christian shoemaker or from a Muslim shoemaker, an infidel? And his answer, he says, you should buy shoes from the person who makes the best shoes. So I think sometimes we overcomplexify it. So some of you may know Bill Pollard. He's the retired chairman and CEO of ServiceMaster. Kind of had a legendary career at ServiceMaster and was obsessed with this question of integrating faith and work. Yeah. And a lot of Christian organizations would approach him and say, Bill, because we know you're a follower of Jesus, we want you to join this association about Christian companies. And Bill, with this sort of a twinkle in his eye, his razor sharp smart, he would say, well, when I get to heaven, I don't think I'm going to see companies going through the gates. I'm going to see people. So he was definitely very uncomfortable with being known as a Christian company for the same theme of what we're teasing out here.
I think it's a next door or maybe a somewhat overlapping topic. We have said that's not our topic because we're really focused on the work. But certainly there are parables or passages in the Scripture that's what they're about. Wealth, the parable of the talents, for instance, which a lot of times with what I mean by the parable of talents. It's often forgotten that talent is a Greek word, talenton, that means a large sum of money. So even the fact that talent in English means skill is due to centuries of misreading that parable as if it were about skill, not about money. And the point of the parable is investing, is investing money. So I do think that there's a biblical movement towards the purpose of wealth is to invest, especially on behalf of other people. And Ruth chapter 2, one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, which I probably never read other than just daily reading through the Bible, was never taught to me in seminary, never came up in a sermon, is all about Boaz investing his wealth in order to help Ruth become a productive worker. And to me, that seems like maybe the central idea in Scripture about use of wealth or capital, to put it another way.
Fascinating. Before I dismiss us, how about we give Will Messenger just a huge round of applause for...